Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today is Harmony Day, the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Why on today of all days has the Prime Minister chosen to weaken protections against racist hate speech?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank the honourable member for his question. And today we are strengthening the Racial Discrimination Act. We are strengthening it because we are making it clear. And we are standing up for freedom of speech. We are standing up for the freedom of speech that underpins our society, the greatest multicultural society in the world. So this is the Australia the Labor Party believe. They believe that Australia is a nation of racists, only held in check by Gillian Triggs and Section 18C. Well, I can tell you, Mr Speaker, we have more respect for the Australian people than the Labor Party does. We know that our precious freedoms, our freedom of speech, is the very foundation of the nation, the great democracy that has caused so many people to come from every corner of the world to join ours, the most successful multicultural society in the world. And we are here in this house of free speech, hard to be heard with the screams of the Labor Party, not very interested in hearing anything but their own prejudices. Mr Speaker, Section 18C has lost its credibility. It lost it a long time ago. It needs to be reformed, and we are putting it in language that does the job. What we are delivering is a stronger and fairer section, a section that will do a better job at protecting Australians against racial vilification and at the same time ensure that university students aren't hauled through the courts for years for putting posts on Facebook, and that cartoonists like the great late Bill Leak don't have to look over their shoulder to see if there's a commission or a lawyer waiting to pounce on them. Mr Speaker, let's be clear. The language that we are proposing to insert in this bill is precisely the intent of the bill when it was first introduced. And Mr Speaker, if I go to the explanatory memorandum of the law when it was introduced in this House by a Labor government, it says the bill maintains a balance between the right to free speech and the protection of individuals and groups from harassment and fear because of their race, colour or national or ethnic origin. So the language we are using is appropriate, it's consistent with the intention of the legislation, and it's clear. It is clear, it is plain, it better sets the balance. It's a stronger law, a fairer law, standing up for freedom of speech and protecting Australians against racial vilification.
The member for Goldstein will resume his seat. Member for Goldstein will resume his seat. Members on both sides. The level of interjections is ridiculously high. I'm not going to keep interrupting ministers. There were interjectors on both sides disrupting the debate. I simply say to those members, I will deal with them. We're not going to have that level of noise for the rest of question time. We're really not, and particularly to the members for Lawler, Gellibrand, Griffith and the member for Hume, who seem to be arguing through the Prime Minister's answer with someone across the other side. I will refer members to my previous statements on this and act accordingly. The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister advise the House how the government's recent energy announcements will make renewable energy reliable for households and businesses, including in the great electorate of Goldstein?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. And of course, his great electorate of Goldstein is located in the state of Victoria. the state whose Premier has an energy policy that is calculated to take that state down the same road as South Australia has been driven by the recklessness of the Labor Party's ideology instead of economics and engineering. Ideology is no substitute for planning. The Labor Party has taken an approach to energy which puts thousands of Australian jobs at risk, which has seen the price of gas go through the roof, which has seen gas less available to business, more expensive than ever, which has seen South Australia enjoy, if that's the right term, the least reliable and the most expensive electricity in Australia. Labor has no plan for energy security at all. No plan at all. A huge renewables target. How are they going to get there? They don't know any more than Jay Weatherill did. Mr Speaker, what this debate needs is engineering and economics. Every step we've taken is securing Australians' energy future. The Labor Party left us with a gas market that was short of gas, price going through the roof. And why was that? Because Labor governments, and especially in Victoria, where the honourable member's electorate is, have been banning exploration. Victoria's got lots of gas. Lots of conventional gas, in fact, Mr Speaker, so there's no need for fracking, but a left-wing Labor government won't allow it to be developed or explored. And of course, Mr Speaker, in South Australia, across the border, the Labor government allowed baseload power to be closed down, one power station after another. And with a wind resource that can generate up to 150% of the state's demand, or, depending on the wind, nothing at all. And so what did they depend on? A long extension cord into the Latrobe Valley. Now we're dealing with that, Mr Speaker. We've addressed the gas issue, working with the gas producers. They have given a commitment to ensure that there will be gas available for peak energy requirements on the East Coast, a vital commitment which we have secured. And we continue to secure more gas for domestic purposes, more domestic gas for Australians. But above all, Mr Speaker, we have taken the biggest step to make renewables reliable by committing to the plan to increase the generation capacity of the Snowy Hydro scheme by 50%. The biggest pumped hydro storage system it will be in the Southern Hemisphere and one of the biggest in the world. That's our approach. Engineering, economics, a plan to secure Australia's energy future.
The member for Cowan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has claimed today's changes to Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act are about increasing freedom of speech. What forms of racial speech does the Prime Minister want people to be able to say that they cannot say right now?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the honourable member for a question, and the question really is this: what is
Members on my left.
speech? What is the speech that the Labor Party say would not be prohibited under the revised wording? What is it? Really, what is it? The terms of harass and intimidate are clear terms, clear English terms, clear, perfectly plain what they mean, to be found in many statutes. The reality is that the language insult, offend or humiliate has been criticised by one expert after another, and indeed the High Court itself has been obliged to define it as involving serious effects not to be likened to mere slights. That's Justice Susan Kiefel, now our Chief Justice. Now, Mr Speaker, it is plain that a statute should speak in language that is clear and accurate. And what we have there is a statute whose language creates a pall of insecurity over writers, over students, over cartoonists, because people look at those words and they say, so that means any insult, any offence, any humiliation, any hurt feelings is prohibited. And it's not an academic point. We've seen it with the university
Member for Griffith is warned.
GUT. We've seen it with Bill Leak. So a clear statute, clear language, provides better protection and provides the protection both for Australians against racial vilification but also the protection of free speech. Australians are entitled to speak freely. It is one of our fundamental rights, and we are striking the balance at the right point between protection against racial vilification and protecting free speech. We've got the balance right. Labor's lost the plot on this and on so many other issues.
Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The member for Parkes. The member for Lawler is warned. The member for Parkes has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on why energy reliability is important for Australia's booming wool production sector? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any threats to the ongoing viability of wool production and processing in Australia and the thousands of hard-working Australians it employs?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, and he, more than most, will be very aware of the huge turnaround we've had in the wool sector. In fact, we are experiencing the best prices, Mr Speaker, in 29 years, and that's adjusted in real terms. Now, this boom means that people in the Western Districts, which the member would be very aware of, are actually making a dollar. People are actually getting ahead, and this has been assisted also by the investment by the Commonwealth in such things as dog fences, especially in south-west Queensland. This also assists in bringing more people into these districts, shearers who bring their kids, they bring their families in and bring commerce into the towns. And this is something that is so formative for our nation. In fact, the Labor Party was started on the basis of the shearers. Now, what's also important is we understand that the returns are also based on the fact that we're getting great returns also from fat lambs. So if we get a ewe and it cuts you about $65 worth of wool now because of the record prices that we're getting, and a fat lamb at about $120 means we're getting about a $180 return from a ewe unit if you put a Borderlester ram over it. This is brilliant returns for people on the land. But of course, there are risks to this, Mr Speaker, and one of the biggest risks is we want to keep Australian manufacturing workers in a job too. But we're losing Australian manufacturing workers because of the price of power. The price of power has become ridiculous, and what we've seen, and especially in Adelaide, and Adelaide would know better than most where Michelle's are, one of our last major wool processing plants, and they've said, and I quote, wool processing energy is intensive, so when faced with a $300,000 rise in the contract price of electricity, the business decided to switch to the spot pricing market, but it can prove volatile. In the past week, we've shut down 2 or 3 times. It was cheaper than paying the power bill. This is what's happening to Australian jobs. This is what's happening to Australian workers. Australian workers are losing their jobs, and their jobs are going to China, their jobs are going overseas because the Labor Party will not deal with the power crisis. They will not deal with the power crisis. Mr Speaker, it's only this side of the chamber that says we're brave enough to build a new coal-fired power station. If we need a new coal-fired power station, we will build a coal-fired power station. It's only this side of the chamber that's talking about hydroelectricity, hydro storage, to make sure that we can actually get new baseload power on. We are trying our very best, Mr Speaker, in areas such as processing of wool to make sure we keep Australian workers in Australian jobs in Australia. But of course, until the Labor Party decides they want to go to bat for Australian workers, until the member for Hunter and the member for Shortland start standing up for Australian workers, then we'll have the Labor Party, led by the Noes, by the Greens, leading Australian jobs overseas, putting Australian workers out of work. And the wool industry is one of the most classic examples of Australia so desperately trying to keep Australian jobs in Australia. And what's the Australian Labor Party doing?
Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Cowan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. As someone who has been subjected to racism time and time again, as I was growing up and even in my life now, please give me an answer. What exactly does the Prime Minister want people to be able to say that they cannot say now?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I understand the point the honourable member is making, and I can
Member for
assure
Sydney is
her
warned.
that my government, and I believe all Australians, are absolutely opposed to racism in any form. The suggestion that those people who support a change to the wording of Section 18C are somehow or other racists is a deeply offensive one. I mean, among the people that have called for its reform are Warren Mundine, Justice Ronald Sackville, Professor Sarah Joseph from the Caston Centre for Human Rights Law, who questions whether the section in its current form is actually consistent with our international human rights obligations to protect freedom of speech. So, in fact, what Professor Joseph, I should say, said was that what may save it from being in breach of our international obligations to protect free speech is the narrow interpretation that the High Court has put on it that I quoted earlier. But surely it is better for the language of the statute to be clear. And the object has always been, as it is in the honourable member's state, where there is legislation that prohibits racial harassment, and that's been well considered by the courts on many occasions. It's a concept that is well understood. We stand for free speech. We are opposed and condemn racial vilification. We oppose and condemn racism in any form, and we are united on that. This will be a stronger, a clearer and a fairer statute.
Members on both sides. The member for Melbourne Ports. Cease interjecting. The member for Melbourne has the
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Senior members of the US military and national security establishment last night warned on Four Corners that climate change is a massive security threat, with sea level rise and droughts fuelling conflict and terrorism. Do you agree that there are national security implications from climate change? If so, given that most fossil fuel reserves need to stay in the ground to meet the 2-degree limit we agreed to in Paris, will you rule out letting the Northern Australian Infrastructure Fund or any other public money subsidise the Adani coal mine and associated infrastructure, or are you happy to use taxpayer funds to threaten our way of life?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the honourable member for his question, and as the honourable member would be aware, the government is very alert to the risk of climate change and the national security implications, particularly of rising sea levels, particularly in our region, that it involves. And of course we have substantial programs right through the Pacific in particular to help our neighbours in the Pacific deal with the consequences of rising sea levels and all of the security implications thereof. As far as the Adani coal mine is concerned, I would simply say this to the honourable member. I understand that he and his party, want to prohibit all coal mining in Australia. I understand that. That's their policy. Mr. Speaker, were Australia to stop exporting coal tomorrow, not only would billions of dollars of export revenue be lost, not only would thousands of jobs be lost, but there would be no benefit to the global climate whatsoever, because if our coal exports stopped, they would simply be sourced from other countries, obviously Indonesia and Colombia being two that spring to mind immediately, but there are many others. The reality is that the Australian coal industry produces coal of a cleaner quality, a higher quality than many of its competitors, low sulphur and low ash. It has our exports, if stopped, as the honourable member would do it, would achieve nothing except reducing the living standards of Australians and absolutely shatter the lives and livings of the communities that depend on the coal industry. It would be an exercise in ideological futility and an exercise that I have to say to the honourable member with great respect is so characteristic of his party, which seems to want to deindustrialise Australia for no purpose other than an ideological one.
Just before I call the member for Murray, I've just got a couple of welcomes. I'd like to inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon a delegation visiting from the United Arab Emirates National Defence College. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome. And we also have present today the former member for Longman, the Honourable Wyatt Roy, in the gallery this afternoon. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. The member for Murray.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy. I refer the Minister to the situation for Puller cold storage in Cobram, in my electorate of Murray, that is experiencing significant increases in energy charges. Will the Minister update the House on why a practical approach to delivering energy reliability and affordability is necessary, and is the Minister aware of any obstacles?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Murray for his question and acknowledge his deep concern about the rising electricity prices for those in his electorate, including Puller's Cold Storage in Cobram, which is a family-owned business that can date back nearly 7 decades, employs 15 people, and recently went out to tender for its electricity contracts. And the offers that came back were 135% higher than over the previous 3 years, some $350,000 higher than over the previous 3 years, Mr Speaker. Now, why is this happening in Victoria? One of the reasons is because the Andrews Labor government was determined to see the closure of Hazelwood, Mr Speaker. One of its ministers said that its continued operation was disgraceful, Mr Speaker, and they tripled the coal royalties on those in the Latrobe Valley. And we also know about the moratoriums and the bans on conventional and unconventional gas extraction, which Geosciences Australia tell us has more than 4 decades' worth of reserves in Victoria. That's why we on this side of the House are determined to rein in network costs, determined to get more gas into the market. That's why the Prime Minister's meeting with the LNG providers was so important, to reform the infrastructure and the pipelines for gas and to get those costs down and to invest in pumped hydro storage, Mr Speaker. But we know that not all of those opposite are happy with the Leader of the Opposition's energy policy, because on the front page of The Australian just last week, the member for Hunter was quoted as telling caucus of their overreach and getting ahead of the public when it came to energy policy, Mr Speaker. Now, the member for Hunter, he might be what we would consider Labor's oracle. But for the Leader of the Opposition, what he says is heresy, Mr Speaker, is heresy. He says it's heresy, but he's not the only one who is ringing the alarm bells when it comes to Labor's policy. Because Ben Davis, the Victorian Secretary of the AWU, has warned about the rush away from gas and coal, in his words, potentially crucifying hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs. That's what the head of the AWU in Victoria said. So members of the Leader of the Opposition's own front bench, members of the Leader of the Opposition's own union have warned him about Labor's energy policy, but somehow the Leader of the Opposition thinks that if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there, Mr Speaker. And that road of your energy policy is less jobs, is higher prices and is less electricity stability. In other words, Labor's energy policy is a road to ruin.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The ABC has today revealed that workers at Sydney Airport are sleeping rough between shifts in their own workplace because they cannot afford to go home between their shifts. When there are real problems like this, why is the Prime Minister's priority today weakening protections against racist hate speech and ignoring workers like this who are suffering?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, my government is focused on delivering the strong economic growth that Australians seek and securing their energy future, on ensuring that we have the opportunities for our children and grandchildren that are even greater than those that we've had. That's our objection. That's our objective. And that's what we're delivering. What Labor focuses on is one ideological agenda after another, whether it is undermining our energy security or seeking to engage in an anti-business campaign, the like of which we haven't seen for several generations. Mr. Speaker, only yesterday, we had the Leader of the Opposition defending his track record as a Labor leader, as a union leader, and his shadow Attorney-General saying how proud they all were of his leadership, of all of the workers he sold down the river, of all of the penalty rate deals he did, of all of the payments that came back to the Australian Workers' Union, carefully documented in the Royal Commission, carefully documented and not exposed. Oh, the member said, it's right. So I thought he was defending the Leader of the Opposition there. Again, I thought he'd know.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Prime Minister resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On relevance, I asked about the scandal at Sydney Airport right now today. What are you doing about these workers, Prime Minister?
His seat. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Minister for Transport to address the issue at Sydney Airport.
The Minister for Transport. The Minister for Transport has the call. Members on my left.
Thank
Leader
you,
of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for the opportunity to clarify the record in relation to the instance referred to by the Leader of the Opposition. And on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we take aviation safety very seriously, and we're proud of Australia's enviable safety record. And my office this morning has sought some assurances in relation to the reports that were on the media last night and again this morning. And I'm aware of concerns that were raised in relation to operations by Aerocare, which is an Australian ground handling company working for many of the major airlines at our major airports. Now, there are a range of mechanisms in place in relation to aviation safety systems, where anyone who's concerned about any safety issues can raise those issues with our safety investigators or the regulatory agencies. These include the ability to make confidential reports directly to the ATSB, which is the Australian Aviation Safety Investigator, and I'd encourage anyone with genuine concerns in relation to those matters to raise those concerns at our airports to use those reporting mechanisms. Now I hear those officers interjecting, and it is irresponsible to making allegations without going through the process of actually making those reports known to the safety investigator, being the ATSB. And it's typical of Labor to be seeking to scare the Australian travelling public, trying to scare the Australian travelling public rather than going through the proper processes. And I emphasise again, Mr. Speaker,
Minister's
on this side of the House we
has
take aviation
concluded.
safety.
The member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister update the House on why affordable and reliable energy is important for successful Australian manufacturing and farm exports? How would alternative approaches jeopardise the prosperity of hard-working Australian exporters and the jobs they create?
The Minister for Trade and Investment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting. I mean, the Leader of the Opposition is critical of us saying we're focused on 18C, and every question's been about 18C. But on this side, another solid question about our national economic plan, about this government's plan to keep boosting economic growth, to keep driving jobs, and to ask what it is that we're doing to focus up new export markets. And I'm very pleased to answer the member for Ford, because unlike that side of the House, he doesn't have an ideological preoccupation with 18C. He's focused on real-world concerns, the real-world concerns that this side knows resonates with Australians. Concerns like jobs, about economic growth, about wages and about opening export opportunities. That's part of the reason why, because of this government's opening of export markets, that we continue to see strong growth in exports. We've seen, for example, Australia's largest ever trade surplus of some $4.7 billion, and our economic plan is translating into more jobs for Australians. The Export Sentiment Index revealed half of Australian exporters are now in a better financial position than 12 months ago. And in fact, nearly 50% of exporters are expecting to create more Australian jobs as a result of this government's positive plans with respect to opening export markets. So the contrast is very clear. But the key that underpins the opportunities for our exports is reliable and affordable access to energy. And that's what's under threat from Labor's party policies. It's only going to be a coalition government that continues to provide affordable energy, that continues to provide reliable energy, because what we've seen are some genuine concerns in the business community. For example, the ABC recently reported that the head of the Food and Grocery Council said that manufacturers will quit Australia if affordable, reliable energy cannot be guaranteed, and said to stop production through a lack of energy is just a disaster. So we know that Labor's policies when it comes to energy are going to be a complete disaster. That's why we've got the vision under this Prime Minister for nation-building projects like the Snowy Hydro 2.0, because we're about growing opportunities for Australian manufacturers, not closing them off. The fact is that the Australian Labor Party will say and do anything. On the 14th of November last year, this guy opposite turned around, he said, and I quote, he said, "I'm not a rampant greenie who thinks there's no place for fossil fuel on our energy mix in the future." But then 2 weeks later, on the 29th of November, he have a Labor Green stacked committee that says we should close down all fossil fuel power plants. That's the kind of tossing and turning we see from the Labor Party. Because this guy, and what Australians know about the Leader of the Opposition, he'll stand in a ute in his high-vis vest, pretending to celebrate the future of Australian manufacturing, but on Friday he'll be sitting on some almond milk crate in the inner city somewhere, claiming that he's going to be so proud to see the demise of Australian fossil fuels.
The Minister's time has concluded. Just before I call the member for Hotham, if it's okay, I just want to do a couple of welcomes. Can I also inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon a delegation from the United States of America, hosted by the Australian Political Exchange Council. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. And I'm also pleased to inform the House we have just been joined on the floor of the chamber by a delegation from the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association of the United Kingdom, led by Mr Ian Little Granger. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. And I call the member for Hotham.
My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to these reports today, which show that Australian federal police officers.
The rule on props.
I refer to reports today that some Australian federal police officers face pay cuts of up to $35,000 a year because of cuts to allowances for working late nights and weekends. Why is the Prime Minister cutting the pay of hard-working police officers who protect Australians at the same time as he's cutting the penalty rates of nearly 700,000 Australians? Why is the Prime Minister determined to cut the pay of Australians who work on Sundays?
The member for Hotham's time has concluded. The Prime Minister or the Minister for Justice?
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My government is absolutely committed to defending and supporting our national security agencies, the Australian Federal Police, the Security Service, the intelligence services, giving them support at a level they have never had before.
Will not use
I'll ask the Minister for Justice to respond to the question concerning the AFP pay.
The Minister for Justice. The Minister for Justice has the call.
Well, you've never seen a better example of the post-truth politics that occupies the minds of the Labor Party. What complete rot! Absolute nonsense. And to march in here and say it says everything about your ability to understand this portfolio. Let's go through the record in relation to the AFP and to Australia's national security. I'll go through this side of the House first, then I'll go through your record in government, which was shameful. In office, we have supported our agencies to do the very difficult job they need to do in an environment which is a deteriorating environment of our national security. We have provided $116 million for the National Anti-Gang Squad, strike teams in every state and territory, which links back into the brains here at the Australian Gangs Intelligence Coordination Centre, $21 million for the Trade Union Royal Commission Task Force. Go after dodgy unionists, the ones who like to punch on against police officers. $25 million to expand the AFP's National Forensics Lab. $15 million for the Fraud and Anti-Corruption Centre. $128 million for the Serious Financial Crime Task Force. $180 million for the protection, the specific protection of the AFP officers who protect us, their personal protection and also protecting their network of buildings around the country. Now let's compare and contrast what happened between 2007 and 2013.
The Minister for Justice will resume his seat. Member for Jagga will cease interjecting the Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On relevance, are you cutting the pay of our police officers, yes or no?
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. Members on my right will cease interjecting. I have cautioned members, including the Leader of the Opposition, on points of order. Points of order are not an opportunity to repeat the question or to paraphrase the question. The Minister for Justice.
Well, I was just interrupted before I was going to run through the record of the Labor Party in office between 2007 and 2013. A shameful record that cut the guts out of the Commonwealth law enforcement community.
Minister for Justice will resume his seat. The member for Isaacs is warned, as is the member for Canberra, and the member for McEwen can leave under 94A. The Minister for Justice has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. When the Labor Party were in office, they cut $128 million from the Australian Federal Police between 2010 and 2013. They cut $30 million and 88 staff from the then Australian Crime Commission, completely gutting that agency, a specialised agency that protects us from organised crime and terrorism. They cut $27 million and 56 staff from AUSTRAC, our anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing agency. It was a shameful record of abuse of Commonwealth law enforcement when they were in office. When we arrived in office, my most important job was rebuilding the damage wrought by the Labor Party for the 6 years of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government.
Ask another one.
The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Sport. I refer the Minister to media reports that show multiple hospitals in New South Wales faced an influx of presentations in emergency departments during recent extreme weather events. How is energy security essential in delivering healthcare services across Australia?
The Minister for Health and Sport.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Barara, who as a former board member of Mercy Health understands just how important energy security is to health security during times of extreme weather events. It's absolutely fundamental to maintaining secure supplies for ventilators, for life support machines, for dialysis machines, for operating theatres. Can you imagine the circumstance if in an operating theatre during a critical operation energy were to be disrupted, if electricity supplies were to be disrupted? That is the sort of fundamental importance of energy security to the health system in Australia. And there are two recent examples about the same extreme weather event and how they played out in different states in different ways. In early February, when there was an extreme weather event facing both South Australia and New South Wales, there were fears that in New South Wales the health system might have been disrupted. However, because of a stable grid and because of good planning, what we saw was continuous supply to the hospital system, continuous protection of life support machines, of dialysis machines, of ventilators, things which could simply not be more important. However, the same event at the same time in a different state, South Australia, played out a very different way, where hospitals in Millicent, in Mount Gambier, in Penola were all forced onto backup generation because they were forced to have load shedding because the South Australian grid was unstable. And I hear mentions of backup generators. The problem is it doesn't always work. We know that in September, the Port Augusta Hospital had its power go down and then its backup generator go down. And that is the problem. The people opposite have no conception that if you really care about health, you have to really care about a stable energy system. And that is why the Prime Minister is responding to the South Australian energy debacle with a plan for the second great wave of the Snowy Hydro scheme to create the greatest battery storage system in the Southern Hemisphere, increasing by 50% storage, which supplies to the grid the stability that is needed for our hospitals, for our health system, for our kidney machines, for our dialysis machines, for our ventilators. These are the reasons why energy security matters. This is why an expansion of stability through the Snowy Hydro scheme doesn't just matter to the electricity system, doesn't just manage to the energy system, but it matters to the health system. And you compare that with the opposition's approach, which is to increase instability in the grid, decrease stability in the health system.
Time has
if you care about
The member for Gorton.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Reserve Bank of Australia has today said, and I quote, "Growth in labour incomes had been unusually weak and, if it were to persist, would have implications for consumption growth and the risks posed by the level of household debt." Given this comment, Prime Minister, why is the government threatening demand and the economy by supporting pay cuts for Australians?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. And I note that the honourable member refers to the recent decision of the Fair Work Commission relating to Sunday and public holiday penalty rates in retail, hospitality and fast food. And the justification the Fair Work Commission gave. This is the Fair Work Commission that the honourable member has again and again and again pledged to support. Again and again pledged to support, just like his leader. He's extolled the virtues of the independent umpire. He supported it, but not now. What did they justify those changes for? The increase in employment, more jobs, more businesses opening. Page after page of examples of small businesses that said that the high rate of Sunday penalty rates and public holiday rates at the moment prevented them from opening. There are pages and pages of them, Mr Speaker. It was a decision based on evidence. The Fair Work Commission's backing small business, and so are we. Now, on the Reserve Bank, Mr Speaker, I'll ask the Treasurer to add some remarks.
The Treasurer has the call.
As the member opposite may not know, Mr Speaker, household consumption in the December quarter, Mr Speaker, grew by 0.5% and was the strongest contributor to our economic growth. Now, the member, as the Reserve Bank has also highlighted, has drawn attention to the issue of wages growth, and the wage price index has been growing at 1.9%. And this is the biggest challenge facing the economy to lift what Australians are earning in this country. But what the Labor Party doesn't understand, Mr Speaker, is you can't get a job in a business that is closed, and you cannot get a pay rise in a company that isn't earning any money, Mr Speaker. Now, those opposite think the money just falls from the sky to pay people's wages. And that's why they think they can tax business all day, all night, and drive them out of business, and people can still get wage increases. Those opposite simply don't get it, that if a business doesn't make money, they can't pay people wages. Now, the real heroes of this economy, Mr Speaker, are the small businesses who have been putting their hands in the pocket year after year after year after they've seen their profits go backwards, and they've kept those employees in jobs. And those opposite should say thank you to those small businesses rather than seek to punish them with higher taxes.
The member for Moreton. The member for Sydney will cease interjecting. She's been warned twice. That's it. The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the government is ensuring that multinational companies pay tax on what they earn in Australia? How does Australia's approach compare with the approaches of other developing or developed economies?
The Treasurer.
Speaker, and I thank the member for Canning for his question. And he knows, because he's part of the Turnbull government that is making multinationals pay their fair share of tax in this country. Now, I hear those opposite scoff, Mr Speaker, but we know that those opposite the Labor Party, when they were in government, did absolutely diddly squat when it came to the issue of making multinationals pay their fair share of tax. Now, here's the record, Mr Speaker. This year alone, as a result of the measures that we brought into this parliament, we will claw back this year $2 billion in revenue from multinationals. This year, Mr Speaker, that is at the advice of the Australian Taxation Office. That is $2 billion that those opposite the Labor Party voted against. They came into this place and said they are going to vote against making multinationals pay their fair share of tax. Now, that is important revenue to support schools and hospitals and pay down the disastrous deficit that those opposite left us through their fiscal mismanagement when they were in government. Now, Labor did oppose those laws, but the laws that we were able to pass through the parliament gave the tax office the power. it gave them the resources, and it gave them the penalties to get the job done. Some $3.7 billion is estimated to be collected as a result of the measures that we've introduced and passed and was opposed by the Labor Party. There are some 71 audits that are currently underway involving 59 multi-billion-dollar multinationals. That's the action that the Turnbull government is taking, Mr Speaker, with the powers and the resources and the penalties that we've given them to get the job done. And it's having the effect. Facebook, Mr Speaker, are now booking their Australian revenue in Australia, not in Ireland, Mr Speaker, as was occurring under the laws that was favoured by the Labor Party. And on top of that, Google have also changed their arrangements. And Chris Jordan, the Australian Tax Office Commissioner, has said this. He said they are abandoning, that is the multinationals now, are abandoning their structures, Mr Speaker, their contrived structures, and restructuring two models where their sales are booked in Australia. Now, Mr Speaker, on top of the measures that we introduced through the multinational anti-avoidance legislation, we have introduced legislation to make sure that people buying things from overseas on a low value will pay GST on those, Mr Speaker. They'll pay GST on those, just like if you go to a street anywhere in Australia and you walk into a shop, you'll pay GST in those premises. So we're levelling the playing field. There is the tax that is now applied to digital services online, and the diverted profits tax that was introduced in the budget will be now coming before this chamber again to ensure it can be passed. We've taken action on multinational tax. Those opposite wanted to let multinationals fleece us.
The member for McMahon.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. There are reports today that the government is preparing to back down on its centrepiece $50 billion tax cut for big business. Just like the Treasurer backed down on an increase in the GST, state income taxes and dealing with the excesses in negative gearing. Can the Treasurer name one major tax reform he's been able to hold on to for more than a year?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. He must have missed the answer I just gave, Mr Speaker. Multinational anti-avoidance legislation, diverted profits tax legislation, low-value goods legislation to make sure that people are paying taxes on the goods that they buy from overseas, Mr Speaker. The biggest change is to superannuation that those opposite didn't have the gall to bring into this chamber, Mr Speaker. But on this side of the House, they talk big in opposition, Mr Speaker, but when they were in government, they didn't go anywhere near it. And so it was this side of the House that brought forward those reforms into this parliament. And indeed, Mr Speaker, even against, I'm no more aware of it than anyone in this chamber, Mr Speaker, but against indeed the opposition of some, even on our own side of the politics. But, Mr Speaker, we had the courage to make those changes. We did, and we remain absolutely committed to ensuring that companies in this country can remain competitive. Now, I met with the new Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, on the weekend, and he made it very clear to me that it's their timetable to get the company tax rate down from over 30% down to 15%, Mr Speaker, down to 15% by the end of the year. Those opposite have a plan to strand Australian businesses in the international economy. They want to see investment go offshore and the jobs and the wages and the living standards that go with them. The only party in this chamber, apart from the Greens, Mr Speaker, who want to see businesses pay more tax is those who sit opposite. They want to see small businesses pay more tax, they want to see medium-sized businesses pay more tax, and they want to put a tax on jobs and a tax on incomes, because those opposite the Labor Party are addicted to higher taxes, and for one reason: they cannot control their spending. They cannot control their spending. And if they were prepared to come into this chamber and support the government when it came to making sure businesses were able to employ people in more situations by having a lower tax burden, and if they would support us on the savings that were necessary, Mr Speaker, they wouldn't be putting our AAA credit rating at risk, which they are.
The member for Grim.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. How does the government's commitment to industrial relations reform help protect employees' pay and conditions by putting an end to corrupting benefits paid by business to unions?
The Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Groom for his question, a distinguished minister in Queensland and the Newman government who's come to join us here in Canberra. And he, like all members of this side of the
Members
House,
on my left,
wants to see the recommendations from the Hayden Royal Commission introduced into the parliament and passed into law, because the Hayden Royal Commission was one of the most far-reaching royal commissions into trade union behaviour in Australia's history. And one of the very important recommendations from the Hayden Royal Commission was that corrupting benefits paid to unions by businesses should be banned, and the people who engage in them should face criminal sanction as a consequence. So yesterday the government announced that we would introduce corrupting benefits legislation to ensure that businesses weren't stood over by unions who then paid the unions money and cash, membership lists and other things in order to get a benefit and an advantage from the union at the expense of the worker. Now, over the last few months, Mr Speaker, there's been plenty of examples that have had quite a public airing. The Prime Minister is fond of talking about Clean Event as well as Chiquita mushrooms and others. But there are several payments over a long period of time from businesses to the union in Victoria which need to be explained. Visy Industries, for example, paid $191,000 to the AWU between 2004 and 2007. IUS Holdings, an income insurance provider, paid $566,000 to the AWU between 2004 and 2007. Alcoa paid almost $90,000, which would be of interest to the Minister for Veterans Affairs, to the AWU in Victoria between 2005 and 2006. Sugar Australia paid $16,000 to the AWU in Victoria between 2004 and 2007, and Austral Bricks $14,000 between 2005 and 2007. Now, there's a pattern here, Mr Speaker, apart from the pattern being these businesses have been paying this money to the AWU in Victoria in a certain period of time. The question is, the National Secretary or the Secretary at that time could tell us why those payments were being made, Mr Speaker. And who do you think was the Secretary at the time of the AWU in Victoria, or the National Secretary, Mr Speaker? Our old friend over here. Our old child over here, the Leader of the Opposition. He was the National Secretary or the State Secretary during that period in 2004 to 2007 when all of those unexplained payments were being made to the AWU. And tomorrow, Mr Speaker, when I have more time, I'll explain what the businesses got in return, because there are many enterprise business arrangements, agreements signed in that time when this guy was running the show. The
House will resume his seat. Will need to wait till tomorrow. His time has concluded. The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On the 9th of September last year, when asked to name his greatest achievement since deposing the former Prime Minister, the member for Warringah, the current Prime Minister said, and I quote, "reforms to business tax." Is the Prime Minister still committed to his centrepiece $50 billion tax cut for big business in full? If not, what will the Prime Minister's new greatest achievement be?
Hear, hear.
Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the honourable member for her question. Mr Speaker, as all honourable members know, if you increase the return on investment, you get more investment. If you get more investment, you get more jobs. That is why her leader, the member for Maribyrnong, defended and promoted company tax cuts in the past. It's why Paul Keating cut
member
company
for Sydney.
tax. It's why Peter Costello cut company tax. It's why countries around the world have reduced company tax, because they know it will increase investment, increase productivity, increase jobs. And the member for McMahon, of course, was so enthusiastic about it that he took pen to paper and actually wrote a book on the subject. We're committed to growth, we're committed to investment. The Labor Party used to claim they were. I'm not sure they were ever really committed. They used to claim they were, but now they are engaged on an anti-business, anti-investment, job-destroying ideological campaign. which can only result in a poorer Australia with fewer opportunities for our children and grandchildren. We're committed to growth, we're committed to jobs, we're committed to opportunity.
The member for Forrest.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the minister update the House on action the government has taken to protect hard-working Australian families from criminal gangs? Is the minister aware of any alternative approach?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for her question. Well, the government has increased the number of visa cancellations quite dramatically over the course of the last 2 years. Mr Speaker, we have increased the number of visa cancellations of non-citizens who are committing crimes in our country against Australian citizens. The number is up by some 1,200%, and we have concentrated on outlaw motorcycle gangs. There are now 138 outlaw motorcycle gang chiefs and leaders who we've cancelled the visas of, and we've made our country a safer place as a result. Now, these people, Mr Speaker, these people have been involved in drug running and extortion, and there's a bit of a lap over because some of them have involvement in the CFMEU. Now, we know that the links between the Labor Party and the CFMEU run pretty deep, but the Leader of the Opposition, when he heard recently that even as of last week, the CFMEU had 56 matters currently before the courts, and there are 110 CFMEU representatives before the courts facing a total of 1,076 suspected contraventions. When the Leader of the Opposition's asked about that, nothing to see here. Nothing to see here. He's never heard of crimes being committed by bikies or by CFMEU members. But of course, he also has a very patchy memory of his past behaviour, it has to be said too, Mr Speaker, because when he set up the Fair Work Commission and when he set up the appointments and appointed Labor affiliates to the positions within the Fair Work Commission, and when the Leader of the Opposition referred the inquiry about Sunday pay rates to the Fair Work Commission, he was envisaging that Sunday pay rates would be cut because when he was a union leader, that's exactly what he sanctioned in the EBAs that his union presided over. Now, he wants you to believe something different, Mr Speaker, but I always say about this Leader of the Opposition, look not at what he says, always look at what he does, because this bloke is not straight up and down, and the Australian public have got it worked out. Now, the CFMEU repaid a bit of a favour to the Labor Party last week because there was a protest in Brisbane where the bikies were marching against the Fair Work Commission decision. But the bikies don't have a great attention span, as it turns out, because I read in the Courier Mail that they walked off the job, and you know where they went? They went to the Grosvenor Strip Club in the Brisbane CBD. Now, they put down their bikes, push bikes in this instance, it looks by the photo in the Courier Mail, the CFMEU flags, and the police were called because quickly there were fights that broke out between the CFMEU members who were not on task but were in the strip club on Union Dime. Now, Mr Speaker, what we know is that there is a lot of irony here, because whilst the CFMEU workers are in Brisbane ripping off their gear, in Canberra they've got a union leader in the Leader of the Opposition who's ripping off
time
workers.
Has concluded. The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Days after last year's budget, the Treasurer said, and I quote, "At the centre of our plan for jobs and growth is a 10-year enterprise tax plan." Is the Treasurer still committed to his entire 10-year plan, a plan the Prime Minister described as his greatest achievement? If not, isn't the government's so-called plan for jobs and growth just in tatters?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, the government is absolutely committed to our plan, comprehensive economic plan to support jobs in this country. But the member opposite wrote a book, an entire book, Mr Speaker, about the reasons why we should be reducing company tax. I mean, he used to believe in a lot of things, Mr Speaker. He says there are other things in the book, Mr Speaker, but I suspect those who've read it would doubt that there was anything in the book, Mr Speaker, other than his impassioned plea that we cut company tax in this
Member
country.
for Rankin.
Now, Mr Speaker, the only person in this chamber, more than anyone else, who needs to answer the question why they have walked away from their commitment to reducing company taxes is the Shadow Treasurer. This is the person who paraded himself
as the great champion of rational economic policy, sitting at the feet of Paul Keating, who also said that we should cut company taxes, and now he's even said that cutting company taxes was a Labor thing, a Labor thing. That's what he thought it was. And when he had the opportunity to support the reduction in company taxes, to support jobs, to support investment, to support higher wages, to support growth, all things he knows are the dividend of that policy, he ran a mile. The Shadow Treasurer is a craven policy coward, Mr Speaker. He is someone who will not stand up to this populist leader of the opposition who will say whatever, whoever, whenever he likes, Mr Speaker, to crassly court a short-term vote. And you would hope that the Shadow Treasurer, who holds himself up as the great professor of Keynesian economics, would stand his ground in the face of a crass populist like the Leader of the Opposition. But when he walks into that shadow cabinet room, he withers on the vine. He cowers in his corner. He cradles up into his fetal position, rocking backwards and forwards and saying, "Whatever you want, Bill, whatever you want." You cannot have a person like this Shadow Treasurer who would stand in control of the nation's finances when all the Leader of the Opposition has to do is whistle at him and he just gets out the chequebook. What a coward.
The member for Flynn.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Small Business. Will the Minister advise the House how union behaviour is impacting on small business, leaving mum and dad small business owners suffering at their expense? What action is being taken to level the playing field and stop corruption within the union movement?
The Minister for Small Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Flynn for his question. He fights for the more than 14,000 small businesses in his electorate each and every day. He ran his own small businesses, Mr Speaker, and like all of us on this side of the House, he knows small business creates jobs. He knows small business creates opportunities, and he wants to back them. He does. But militant unions and the ALP, Mr Speaker, do not. While we try to help small business hire more Australians, Labor and militant unions sell workers down the river. They reduce take-home pay for hard-working families. The Daily Telegraph has told the story of fast food workers whose weekend pay was cut because of backhanded deals by union bosses in enterprise bargaining agreements. Unlike small business people who do the right thing, militant unions are rewarding themselves at the expense of the very people they falsely claim to represent, with backhanded deals. And while small business follows the rules, the new ACTU secretary believes unions should not. Unions cry foul that workers' pay will be reduced, but let's not forget the Fair Work Commission was established by Labor. Its commissioners appointed by Labor. Its review started by Labor. And that man there said he would abide by its decisions. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. 3 times he said it. And now Sally McManus will turn a blind eye as militant unions break the law. She said so in her very first interview. And that's why we're stamping out dodgy deals, Mr Speaker, levelling the playing field of small business and helping them to grow. But what about the so-called workers' champion here? What about the member for Maribyrnong? Does he believe that there should be more jobs in small business? Does he believe that the playing field should be level? Does he think that union kickbacks are wrong? Does he agree with Sally McManus that laws are meant to be broken? Mr Speaker, this man is a handbrake to jobs, and he doesn't believe in a fair go for small business. All small business owners ask for is a fair go. That's all. The small business people such as Frank Michaelopoulos, who runs a burger shop in Matraville with his wife and mother in the member for Kingsford Smith's electorate, he said it's hard to grow their business when they have to pay staff more than their competitors on Sundays. It's successful, but how successful can it get, he asked. It's a good question, Mr Speaker. It's a good question. It's better than the questions that we get asked by those opposite. But, Mr Speaker, the member for Kingsford Smith, the member for Maribyrnong are not listening to small business. They stopped listening a long time ago. Labor and the unions love to hold small business to ransom, just as they did with owner-driver truckies with the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal. The only ones they now listen to are the militant
are the thuggish union bosses who do not respect the rule of law. Mr Speaker, that is a very sad reflection on the principles they once held near and dear, and it's a very sad reflection on the shonky leader opposite.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Wages growth is at record lows. Underemployment is at record highs. The unemployment rate has increased to nearly 6%. Is the Prime Minister still committed to his entire $50 billion tax cut for big business, a plan that the Prime Minister has previously modestly described as his greatest achievement? And if not, what's left of the Prime Minister's one-point plan for jobs and growth?
The Prime Minister has.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Not for the first time the Leader of the Opposition has been loose with the facts. Of course, he was preceded by the member for Sydney. In the interview that she was referring to, the journalist said, and this was at a conference in Micronesia, "What would you say is your greatest achievement since being Prime Minister?" And I responded, "Jobs and growth. 3.3% economic growth. What about that? Continued strong growth in jobs. A continued strong transition from a mining construction boom that is one that is more diverse." That was my answer. And you have to go on for words and words as we go through the Defence White Paper, innovation, superannuation, business tax cuts reform, NDIS. We talk about all those measures. So the reality is, Mr Speaker, the member for Sydney and her leader have stood up here and said that I was asked what was my greatest achievement in the year as Prime Minister, and I'd said the business tax cuts. Completely and utterly false. Completely and utterly false. The answer is there. Once again, no regard for the truth. Talk about post-truth politics, the parallel universe in which they inhabit.
I think I know what's coming. All right, let's do it. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Understanding Order 201, I asked the Prime Minister to table the document he was reading from.
I say to the Manager of Opposition Business, he might have highlighted the need to update the standing orders, but I'm sure there's one that covers ridiculousness. The member for Bowman.
Thank you, Speaker. Question to the Minister for Justice and the Minister assisting the Prime Minister for counter-terrorism. Will the Minister update the House on the work of the Trade Union Joint Police Task Force? Minister, what are the threats to the success of the task force?
The Minister for Justice has the call. The member for Sydney will want to be in here for the NPI, I'm presuming.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for that question. Now, the Royal Commission into Trade Union Governance found one thing very clearly after its 21-month investigation, and that is that there is widespread lawlessness amongst some in the union movement. And the new Secretary of the ACTU, Sally McManus, confirmed that on her first day in the job, when she said that it was all right for unionists to break laws that they didn't agree with. Now, when that happened, the member for Moreton and the member for Batman took to Twitter to claim that that made her a cross between Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. Now, this government is not prepared to stand by and watch law-breaking from any section of Australian society. And you need to look no further than the Secretary of the CFMEU in Victoria, John Setka. He heads up the CFMEU, the bikie wing of the union movement, Victoria's State Secretary of the CFMEU, who's been charged and convicted in relation to 40 separate charges. 5 times for assault, 7 times for willful trespass, 5 times for resisting arrest, and 5 times for assaulting police. And where did we last see John Setka? Where did we last see him? In 2016 at Bill Shorten's election night party.
The Minister will resume his seat. I said many times, ministers, all members need to refer to members by their correct titles, and I warn the Minister.
I'll rephrase, Mr Speaker. We last saw John Setka, the head of the CFMEU in Victoria, at the Leader of the Opposition's election night party in 2016. What an endorsement of this sort of behaviour, where someone who punches on with police is invited to come and celebrate after the 2016 election. Now, we won't stand for law-breaking in the Liberal Party. We won't stand for it. And we've established joint task forces with the Australian Federal Police and their state police counterparts to investigate and prosecute union law-breaking. And to do so, we investigated $21 million so they can do their job. But I've been advised just recently by the Queensland Labor government that they're going to withdraw Queensland Police from that task force. They apparently think there's no union law-breaking in Queensland, which is interesting because the CFMEU has a branch in Queensland, and the former president of the CFMEU was one who has been charged for allegedly colluding to organise construction on his home, making a personal gain in excess of $400,000. So the Queensland Labor government withdraws Queensland Police resources from this joint task force, going after union corruption. Well, clearly this task force's success is one of the reasons why they've decided to withdraw police resources. Now, the Leader of the Opposition wants to run the country like he ran the union, and that means a wink and a nod to corruption, turning a blind eye to people who have a rap sheet as long as John Setka, and doing nothing about union corruption in any state of Australia.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the Prime Minister. The Leader of the House with papers.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.